breaking news for your home. Wayday! Wayfair's big sale is almost here, and you can score the best deals in home. Like up to 80% off everything home. Yes, you heard that right. 80% off with free shipping on everything. Plus surprise flash deals all Wayday long. We're talking outdoor furniture and essentials, rugs, and more. All at Wayfair, and all up to 80% off during Wayday. Shop Wayfair's Wayday from April 25th through 27th.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
History as it happens, December 5th, 2025. Ken Burns' Revolution. These are the times that try men's souls, wrote Thomas Paine in The American Crisis, his pamphlet in 1776. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Americans will soon show how much they value their past, their national origins, when celebrating the nation's 250th birthday next year. But you can get started now by watching Ken Burns' latest documentary, The American Revolution, totaling 12 hours over 6 episodes on PBS. It immerses you in those uncertain and dangerous times when resistance turned into revolt, into a war for independence. A civil war fought between patriots and loyalists, when black people, free and enslaved, fought on all sides, as did native peoples. A global war involving the French and Spanish, too. The American Revolution on PBS casts a wide net with a remarkable cast. Recognize this voice?
Has the God who made the white man and the black left any record declaring us a different species? Are we not sustained by the same power, supported by the same food, hurt by the same wounds, pleased with the same delights, and propagated by the same means? And should we not then enjoy the same liberty and be protected by the same laws? Some consider us as much property as a house or a ship, and think how anxious we must be to raise ourselves from this degrading state. James Fortin.
That was Morgan Freeman. How about this one?
The unparalleled perseverance of the armies of the United States through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the space of 8 long years was little short of a standing miracle.
Josh Brolin as George Washington. Everybody, and I mean everyone, lowly farmers, powerful merchants, women, Indians, the enslaved, had a stake in this history-shaping event, even if they tried to stay out of the war itself, even if they never picked up a musket. Its outcome would affect their material conditions in the here and now, the principles that were fought for, the Enlightenment ideal of fundamental human equality, articulated in the Declaration of Independence, would shape and often test the new nation. And is still rippling today. The American Revolution is still important. It affects our lives now. And that's why this documentary matters. We're living in the consequences of the forces set in motion by the creation of the United States after a destructive war with Great Britain from 1775 to 1781, the Treaty of Paris signed in 1783. David Schmidt co-directed and co-produced The American Revolution with Ken Burns and Sarah Botstein. Historian Geoffrey Ward was the writer. Our conversation with David Schmidt and Geoffrey Ward next. David Schmidt, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
And Geoffrey Ward, welcome.
Thanks.
Let me just say it's an honor to have you. Congratulations on your terrific documentary, 12 hours long in 6 episodes. So much for the, supposedly short attention spans of the American public, right?
I hope so. I think there's just so much more to this story than can be fit into a soundbite, and I think people are ready to just sit there and learn.
I think we could have done 24 hours.
Yeah, on just one aspect of the war,
Sure.
the military
Sure.
campaigns, role of women, Native Americans. So why don't we start with then a big question? David, I'll start with you. Your overall approach to the subject matter. We're talking about a sprawling subject. You have to decide what goes in, what goes out. How to tell this story in pictures, because I have it on good authority that George Washington's iPhone battery died the day of the Battle of Yorktown, so he was unable to take a video of what was happening there.
My joke is that Benjamin Franklin got too involved in politics and war, so he didn't have time to invent the photograph. You know, I worked on with Ken a previous film about Benjamin Franklin, speaking of, and that was 4 hours, 2 episodes. And he's probably the most painted person of the 18th century in North America until George Washington took over from him for that spot. So there still wasn't that much to look at for him. But we made it work by showing in some small reenactments what it took to do the work that he did. So in Benjamin Franklin, that's moving the printing press with his hands. You got to see that effort. You got to see how much that job involves both the mind and the body. And we realized that that was working in that film and applied it to this film. So if you're going to see an 8-year-long war that takes place all across the 13 colonies, but also beyond into the Appalachian, over the Appalachians into Indian country, along the Gulf Coast, in the Caribbean, overseas, into Canada, takes an awful lot of human effort, this war effort.
Sure.
And in order to see that, you need to see people. And we're never going to see those people in such a way that, you see their face and you think, what does this guy do for a day job? But you're going to see the effort that it took. You're going to see people walking through mud. You're going to see people walking through snow. You're going to see people making guns.
Yeah, I think not showing the faces is more effective. I was glad that you didn't do, and I wasn't expecting this either. Reenactments of someone playing Thomas Jefferson, and that would have been...
It just takes you out.
Yes.
And one of the things that we're really grateful for is that Buddy Squires, Ken's longtime cinematographer, has the best eye. And so he just shoots some really beautiful footage that your eye can linger on while you listen to Jeff's magnificent words.
Sure.
Or voices from the 18th century recording their memories. If you're not distracted by what you're looking at, then you can actually pay attention to this really complicated history.
And Geoffrey, as the writer and a historian yourself, you're synthesizing decades of scholarship. I mean, how do you even begin to get your mind wrapped around all of this information? And of course, has to match the pictures and the pacing, right? When, again, there's just so much material to work with.
That's a big question. This is my 20th film with Ken. I think in some ways it was the hardest one, and it's partly because I didn't know anything about this period. I was the editor of American Heritage for several years. I've written a lot about the 19th century, about 20th century politics. When I was editor, we were sort of required to have in every copy, in every issue, a story about colonial times or the Revolution. And there was a picture editor on our staff who called it all short pants history. And we were faintly dismissive of it, really, because it seemed so remote. All those wigs and buckled shoes and spinning wheels and muskets. And so when I was asked to do this and sort of threw myself into reading, I realized how incredibly alive and human and reachable it actually is. That film is about real human beings trying to do an incredibly difficult thing on all sides. That is very appealing to anybody who likes to write about history and about individual human beings.
An enormous written record is left over from ordinary people, too. And you have some pretty well-known actors, voice actors, doing the voiceover work, too. That helps.
I'll just say that you pinch yourself. And I think we all took screenshots. We work with Morgan Freeman over Zoom. You don't forget that experience.
Yeah.
And not just him, obviously. Matthew Rhys was incredible, Meryl Streep, et cetera, et cetera.
Most people who pay attention to this type of stuff are familiar with the quotes of the founding fathers that are related in your film. But I was really impressed with ordinary people's observations. One, their writing was so good. And just the way they viewed the war from the eyes of an ordinary person, the violence, the fear, the disruption, the tension, you really capture that. The urgency of the moment.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. But also thanks to that generation who knew they were living through history. Alan Taylor points out in the film that 18th century North America was the most literate place on the earth after Scandinavia, which is something I didn't know going in. They proved it. And there's been a lot of work done in the last, I don't know, several decades to surface that material, scan a lot of the documents and manuscripts. We found some that weren't online, of course, but there's just a lot out there that a lot of people have committed a lot of work to get available. I'll also just say, okay, George Washington's the person we hear from the most in this film. I don't think I could have named a quote of George Washington's before this that wasn't fake. I can't tell a lie, or I chopped down that cherry tree or whatever. And it turns out he's actually a pretty good writer too. And not only that, you get from him, because of course people kept whatever he wrote, you get his general orders that are like, men, stand strong, be men. This is the time for your country. At the same time, he's writing home to his brother saying, I don't think we're going to win this.
Yeah.
And that is so interesting.
Yeah, it is. We have a couple of grunts that we follow through. Their writing is wonderful too. It's not rolling and eloquent and so on. It's real human beings remembering what they did.
And sometimes it's really funny, especially Joseph Plum Martin.
It's often funny, and it's often ironic and wry, and it sounds just like a GI in World War II. These officers don't know what they're doing. It's all up to us. Christ, why don't they feed us more? Why don't we get paid? Again, they are real human beings having real problems that we can all identify with.
So, Geoffrey, let me ask you a question then about the scholarship that informed your writing. If a documentary like this was made, 60 years ago, it would have been a lot different. Probably less emphasis on people who weren't the founding fathers. You incorporate a lot of the old guard. Bernard Bailyn, who passed away, was interviewed for this documentary. Gordon Wood is in there. You also have younger scholars, too, who are looking at this war differently, through a different prism.
Let me just pay tribute to the group of scholars that helped us. As I said, I've done a lot of films, and we always have academic advisors. And sometimes they are hugely helpful, and sometimes they just are present in order to preen for one another and show that I've read more books than you have. None of that happened here. These are people who really were interested in getting this story as right as we could get it. And we listened to them, and they listened to us, and they were fascinated, I think, all of them, by the sort of process of what you do, what you can include, what you can do with pictures, what you can't do. And they were happy to find that we were interested in complicating the story, because it is a hugely complicated story with all kinds of different people with all kinds of different interests. You're absolutely right that a film made a while ago would have been the revolution that I remember from school all long ago, which was basically those guys in white wigs having great thoughts with one another, and George Washington surviving Valley Forge and then winning the revolution. I mean, that's sort of what kids come away from in fourth grade, and a lot of people never get much beyond that. And we really tried very hard to include as many different kinds of people and different kinds of stories as we could. And they did include Native Americans, African Americans, women, not because we were checking some boxes, but because that's how it really happened, how it really unfolded.
A lot of these people might write about a certain aspect of the war. Kathleen Duvall, for instance, had written specifically about the Gulf Coast during the war, but she teaches the American Revolution. So she knows an awful lot more than she's written about. And that's the case for a lot of the other people as well. There are a few people who don't teach the American Revolution who might write about Caribbean history, for instance. And I think they were fascinated to see how their work fit into the larger puzzle. It isn't just a one thing. Of course it's not.
Yeah, not everyone came out of the revolution a winner.
Just because of how it's ingrained in us, from the flag to the 4th of July to our currency, maybe you don't question it as much.
Well, the Native American scholars, people who specialize in Native American history is what I mean, who are in the film, I mean, they have a different vantage point.
Colin Calloway was my professor in college, took 3 classes with him. And he'd always say at the beginning of the term, American history doesn't make any sense without American Indian history. That should be obvious, but I don't think it's ever more obvious than with this film.
David mentioned the Caribbean. One of the surprises to me early on was, thanks to them and to stuff they'd written, I had not understood that our war was a sort of a sideshow compared to the economic riches of the Caribbean. We were poor cousins. That remained true through this whole period. And that system, of course, is based on hideous, hideous slavery.
Well, then, other than losing their colonies on the mainland, the British came out of the American Revolution pretty strong. They moved to defend those islands in the Caribbean from the French, which is
Right.
one reason why they gave up on fighting the colonists on the mainland.
Right.
It's all contingent on history. They happen to have a series of wars with France in the next few decades that winning pretty decisively cemented their, whatever we call it, the Second British Empire in a way that they wouldn't have necessarily imagined in 1781. I don't think that they thought that they had come out ahead then.
Yeah, no, they probably didn't. So, about the causes on the Native American theme, Geoffrey, it is taught, and it is, of course, accurate, that the revolution is largely the result of a dispute that starts over taxes and then it moves to rights and parliamentary sovereignty, the principle, and wanting self-government, right? But it's also about land, and that involves Indians.
David is better on this subject than I am, but that was another surprise to me. I mean, I really came through this the way a lot of Americans do. And the fact that the British said you could not go beyond the Appalachians infuriated colonists. They'd joined in this battle that had defeated the French. They thought their reward was going to be that they could spill over the mountains and take land. And the British, not because they loved Indians, but because they couldn't control what would happen if those pioneers went over the mountains, forbade them from doing so. And it enraged people, among them George Washington. That story is essential to understanding this war, and certainly was not taught when I was in school.
The line of
Yeah.
proclamation, 1763.
The American Revolution meant something different to whoever was involved in it. So for somebody like Harry Washington, who's using the crisis of the revolution to win his freedom, it's about ending slavery for him and his posterity. For somebody like Dragging Canoe in Cherokee country, the American Revolution is an opportunity to defend his people's sovereignty and independence. I guess what I'm saying is there's all sorts of things involved. There's home rule, there's empire, there's, in the case of some people who join the fight later on, maybe around the Declaration of Independence, there's the possibility of liberty. It becomes a war for union, independence, and republic, but that's not what it is at the beginning. All I can say, full stop, is that the American Revolution began because Boston was occupied by the British. It began to try to get a redress of grievances and bring things back to the way they were. That said, in the 10 years before Lexington and Concord, 12 years before Lexington and Concord, there's a series of moves by the British government that started to infuriate colonists. And those involved the taxes and representation that we're familiar with, and of course the 1763 proclamation that Jeff was referring to. They didn't stick to that ruling, though. So it was just a thing on paper. And I think it may have hurt the speculators because they couldn't make money off the sales, but the settlers kept going.
Sure. There was no way to enforce it. I mean,
There's no way to enforce it. So again, it's not the cause of the war, but the war is about many things. And also during the war, they're paying recruits with the promise of Indian land. So in that way, it's also about Indian land. It is about so many things. One thing for sure it is about is the future of the continent of North America. And that can mean all sorts of different things, but one primary thing that means is land and expansion.
Yeah, material interests are there, but ideas as well. Our country is founded on ideas, not an ethnicity, not one religion, not one race. David, based on your answer there, I want to hear from both of you on this, but it's a perfect segue to my next question. When do complaints become protests, become resistance, become revolution? And of course, we're talking about a very large geographic area. Some places crossed the Rubicon, so to speak, before others did. I shared with you an article that T.H. Breen wrote, a review for the New York Review of Books, of a book written by Mary Beth Norton about the long 1774, how Virginia became a revolutionary colony. Because we all know the war begins in the spring of 1775, the fighting. So you can say, okay, that's the point of no return. Blood has been spilled. But in February 1775, 2 months before these battles, Parliament had already declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. And we can also look when news of the Coercive Acts reaches the colonies, May 1774, which was in response to the Boston Tea Party, which had happened in December 1773. Of course, it always takes a long time for information to go back and forth across the ocean. What I'm getting at here is, this is my view. The real tipping point here was not just the Boston Tea Party, but the British response to this.
Yeah.
When we look at the causes of the war.
I completely agree.
Yeah. Well, because when we look at the causes of the Revolutionary War only from the position of the colonists and their actions, we lose sight of how they were responding to a very heavy-handed, unnecessary response by Parliament and the king that did not have to be that way. They drove the colonists into revolt.
The Americans have made a discovery, or think they have made one, that we mean to oppress them. We have made a discovery, or think we have made one, that they intend to rise in rebellion. Our severity has increased their ill behavior. We know not how to advance, they know not how to retreat. Some party must give way. Edmund Burke.
I think that that's true. I mean, how can you say what they should have done? Because if they had made this decision earlier, it would have been different. But they dealt in half measures for a long time. They repealed the Stamp Act. They repealed the Townshend Acts except for tea. And who would have thought that to them, the Rubicon was tea in the harbor? But apparently it was. They reacted with martial law. It's the closing of the port, closing of the representative government. Those are all things that anybody in any colony, not just the 13 colonies that ended up revolting, would have been really ticked off about.
And that's what unifies the colonies too. Why a Virginian now would care about what's happening to a person.
Absolutely. I mean, they're already caring and they're already communicating, but that is going to get the average Joe to be like, what is happening here? That's immediate. You can understand the impact of that. And closing the port of Boston isn't just punishing Boston. It's punishing all the fishing towns up and down, New England. I can't imagine this being settled without violence after that point.
Revolt, but not necessarily a consensus about going all the way to independence.
And then there's just some basic stuff. I can't quote the guy, David. I think it's a Minuteman. It's a militia person in any case, who was asked why he's going to Lexington and Concord, or why he's going to Cambridge, I guess.
Yeah.
And he basically...
We've always governed ourselves and we always meant to.
That's right. We always governed ourselves and we always meant to. I mean, that's what a lot of people who didn't have a large view of the world thought, I think. Those people are not treating us right. We are independent, small I, independent people.
Geoffrey, how do you feel about the Loyalists?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that this show did was make me do sort of family archaeology. I went back into my own family and I've discovered that I am descended from two different revolutionary people. The wonderfully named General Aphroditus Ward, who took 300 cattle from East Haddam, Connecticut to Valley Forge, and a guy named John Ward, his cousin and also my ancestor, who immediately, as soon as the shooting started, joined a Loyalist regiment, served throughout the war, and ended up in New Brunswick because he couldn't stand to live here. I am oddly sympathetic to both of them. The Loyalist position was a perfectly respectable position, seems to me. Things were pretty good. I'm only being asked to pay a little tax. Maybe we can persuade them to not do that if we act in a civil manner. And I don't want the world disrupted, and I don't want people who share my view to be mistreated, which Loyalists were. So to me, it becomes a much less black and white war, not because of my ancestors, but because I was just fascinated to find them both.
David, do you want viewers to sympathize with the Loyalists?
I don't want to tell any viewer how to think about anything. I want them to have their own takeaways, and I know that they'll be different from me, and I know that if I watch it again in 5 years, my own views will be different. That said, this film should allow people the opportunity to at least understand the decisions, the motivations of why people are making the decisions they're making. And like Jeff said, being a Loyalist is a defensible position. It might be a good thought exercise. I don't necessarily need people to do this, but what decision would I make? Well, I can tell you that decision I would make would be entirely dependent on when I'm making that decision and where. Sure. If I'm in Boston in 1775, I'm probably a patriot, but there's other situations where that would not have been the case.
A lot of people just wanted to keep their heads down too and hope that whatever was happening wouldn't disrupt their lives.
Of course.
Right.
As you make clear in the film, there were not modern logistics. We did not have a large industrial base. Armies lived off the land, which meant pillage, plunder.
That produced Loyalists or produced patriots, depending on who had burned their barn and took their sheep and molested their women, and both sides did all of those things. That brought the war home to people who might have tried to keep their heads down and made them be on one side or another.
I think that one thing that we don't often consider when we think about the American Revolution, we know that the Civil War was fought in North America, obviously, but most of the American wars were not. And so the fighting is not at home. The American Revolution is in everybody's backyard. All the big cities are occupied at one point or another during the war. Armies are marching through all sorts of different territory. So this is at home. If people are concerned that there's too much women's presence in this film, I'll just ask them to remember that this is a war that's impacting all sorts of different civilians, and let alone the women that follow the armies. So as much as we can tell their story, we'd like to.
What I really love about your visuals is the use of maps to detail just what it took to get an army into position to fight where you hoped you knew your enemy was based on intelligence or scouts.
Mm-hmm.
But, I was thinking about this watching the show. The narration says, and then they marched 5 miles after crossing whatever river, or 9 miles to battle. They marched all night. I'm like, okay, that doesn't seem like a lot. Then I thought about how, to march 9 miles in whatever shoes these guys had, or some cases it was more than that. There was one scene there, the Battle of, I think it was Brandywine or Germantown, where Patriots had to run 4 miles. Yeah, 4 miles in 45 minutes to get into position.
And then they got to fight.
Carrying all the equipment, blazing hot sun, and then had to fight. It's just really incredible to think of it that way.
How would you like to march from Westchester County to Yorktown, Virginia? That's a hike. And that whole army, both the French and the Continental Army, did that.
Because our modern minds, we think of distances of 9 miles as nothing. But when you're on foot or on a horse.
There's actually an interesting moment in the film where somebody in England is talking about how they just don't understand North America. He says, because the word Yorkshire takes up as much space as the word America, we thought they were much the same bigness. But it is as far from London to Venice as it is from Charleston to Boston. Basically, I think you could take that to yourself, too, because we know Google Maps and we know driving and all this. They're walking and they're bringing animals behind them, and they don't have Gore-Tex. They don't have air conditioning. Even when we were out filming in places and it's snowing and we were complaining, you couldn't complain too much because you knew what people actually had to live through back then.
So here's a question. There was so much violence and vandalism, property destruction among colonists between loyalists and patriots, perpetrated against one another. Very rough treatment. But the American Revolution never turned into terrorism or the French Revolution. We had tarring and feathering, which was awful, but no guillotine. Why do you think that is?
Part of the reason the French Revolution did that is they had city mobs. They had big city mobs. They didn't really have that here. We didn't have the numbers in a city that they did. I also think, the distinction between an ordinary Frenchman and the aristocracy that ran that place was much worse. At one point I was working on the book. It's not in the film, but I learned that after, I think it's 1781, you could not be an officer in the French army unless you were the son of aristocrats on both sides of your family. When the Trumbull painted the surrender at Yorktown, and I was working on the captions for the pictures, I found out, I think there are, I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but I think there's 6 French generals on the left side of that painting. I think 4 of them were decapitated during the Revolution.
I mean, I think that's a bigger question about the French Revolution than about the American Revolution. And a couple things about it that I'll say is the American Revolution, there's a surrendering side, or a side anyway, that signs away that they lost. In the French Revolution, it's not quite like that. Also, it's coming from an authoritarian system, so the systems that are going to replace them are also going to maybe try to be authoritarian. Yeah. Whereas in the United States, they're trying to create these separate governments that coexist. There's an attempt at the start, and then it really gets codified by the time of the Constitution, to be able to peacefully disagree with each other.
Sure.
Not sure there wasn't terrorism.
There was. Yeah.
The destruction of Indian people surely was terrorism, it seems to me. People burned people's houses for miles and miles on both sides. It was really awful.
Our conversation continues. Here's a couple of bones to pick. Early in your film, you claim that the Iroquois Confederation influenced Ben Franklin when he appeared in Albany in 1754. This is a contested point among historians. What is your argument for that?
I don't think we claim that.
Okay.
Personally, what we're doing in that scene is setting the stage for how important union is. And the first narration you're going to hear, so you hear Conisatego say, "We know our lands are become more valuable." Then you hear the narrator say, long before the United States, there were 6 nations that had formed a union called the Haudenosaunee. That's true. Then you hear Conisatego say, "We are strong because of our union. You guys should have one too." That's obviously a paraphrase. He did not say "you guys." And then we say, in 1754, the celebrated printer and philosopher Ben Franklin wanted to form a union of his own. So that's all true. One followed the other. And what we're getting at here is that here's a union of 6 nations that is threatened, maybe even broken by the American Revolution.
Sure.
The union of the colonies was not possible until the Revolution. And so the theme throughout the series, one of the major themes throughout the series is union. The last episode is called The Most Sacred Thing. That's Thomas Paine referring to the union is the most sacred thing. So that's what I think that scene's about. It's not trying to say one thing influenced the other necessarily, but the truth is this union existed before. Conisatego recommended it for colonists. Ben Franklin tried to do something with colonists. It didn't work. And then that phrase, "join or die," was used during the Revolution.
Right.
And I think some of the reaction to this online has been over the top. This takes up about a minute in a 12-hour documentary. So
Right.
it wasn't a big deal, but I did want to ask you about that. Next one, the Dunmore Proclamation. Now, you're not saying this was a major turning point in the war, but you do give this a lot of weight with the use of a quote by Rutledge, who was a South Carolinian, not a Virginian, who was in Philadelphia at the time. November of 1775, Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor of Virginia, issues his proclamation that the enslaved people of rebels who reach British lines are free. This story's been told a lot since the 1619 Project came out. I thought you gave this Rutledge quote too much emphasis because he was speculating based on secondhand knowledge.
Can you remind us the Rutledge quote is the one that says, "It has done more to turn people than any other expedient," right?
Well, here it is. It's in a private letter. South Carolinian Edward Rutledge, who was among the last to vote for independence. He said of the Dunmore Proclamation, tending in my judgment, more effectively to work an eternal separation than any other expedient which could possibly have been thought of."
I don't think the proclamation turned people toward the patriot cause, but I think it deepened the anger of white Southerners.
It also brought the war to Virginia,
including George Washington, who wants Dunmore killed because he's so frightened of what will happen in the South. I think the 1619 thing was wrong to make it seem as if it accounted for Virginia patriotism, but it certainly deepened the fear that those people lived in.
Right. And it made it so that the war was in Virginia when previously it was only in Massachusetts. So when the war's on your doorstep, you have to choose a side more often than not.
There's no evidence that any colonists changed their mind or switched sides as a result, going over to the Patriot side. I mean, Dunmore himself reported back he was able to convince some number of people to stay loyal to the government rather than go to the other side.
So why would you take Dunmore's word over Rutledge's? Doesn't Dunmore have a reason to
exaggerate? He
overstate his case to Britain?
Yeah, he may have exaggerated.
He did that all the time. He claims, except for smallpox, virtually all the slaves in the South would have rallied to him, and he could have taken back Virginia. Instead, he stayed on his boat.
Already lost the colony.
It was a desperate and not successful thing, but it did further anger people who were already angry.
And it certainly changed the fortunes of a lot of Black Virginians.
I think it's a major piece of African-American history. But as far as the sweep of the Revolutionary War, I don't think it's very important at all. But
I think it's very important because in a lot of contingent ways, it's very important. If they had invested in the South sooner, which they tried to do, this is their precursor in a lot of ways to the Southern strategy, as is Sullivan's campaign, of course, Sullivan's Island. But that takes place over a day. Dunmore's campaign is months long. The British, by the time of the Southern strategy, it was too late for them to do what they might have wanted to do. So who knows what could have happened? But I think it's very important, Dunmore's proclamation. For one thing, it's in the Declaration of Independence.
This is what Dunmore reported about his proclamation. And again, he could have been exaggerating here. Says it received an immediate and positive reception when over 100 former rebels signed loyalty pledges the day after. He estimated 3,000 Virginians pledged to support the royal government, which is different than, say, and you're not arguing this, 3,000 Virginians saying, we're on the fence, now we're going to join the rebellion. There's no evidence that any Virginians joined the rebellion as a result of the proclamation, but
we agree. I don't think either of us is saying that they did. I'm just saying that it gave people an added reason to be willing to join the rebel cause, but didn't mean they got off the fence to do that. Sure. I think these were already people who were angry. And I think Washington is the perfect example. He was really, really, really upset about Dunmore and what he thought it was going to mean. It didn't turn out to mean that, but he can't see in the future just as we can't.
George Washington. I really like how you depict Washington in all of this. As a strategist, as a tactician, as a politician, as a guy who's in a really difficult situation. He wasn't a great battlefield commander. A lot of what he tried to do did not work. But, I hesitate to come down too hard on Washington for, say, the defeats in New York, where the war could have been over had his army been captured on Long Island, or after the Brandywine, or after Germantown. I think everyone knows this. He had a really difficult hand to play. To call the Continental Army an army at certain points of the war is a stretch.
To me, the most important thing about Washington is his absolute loyalty to civilian control. That doesn't happen in revolutions, in rebellions. And he doggedly listened to them even when he thought they were idiots, which he did quite often, was a dutiful American soldier under civilian control in 1776 or 1777. That's amazing to me.
How he held the army together. They had no money, clothing, food, ammunition, what have you. Terrible conditions, sleeping outside. Right. And the Congress couldn't give him a penny.
I think it's fair to criticize him for Long Island and maybe Brandywine too, or definitely Brandywine too. And so, I think he's not the greatest battlefield general, but I also think we should give him his due for those 10 crucial days at Trenton and Princeton, some really wonderful generalship. Yep. He also, of course, held people together in Boston and won that siege as well. I think he's a great commander, not necessarily a great general.
Yeah.
He kept everybody together.
He was fighting a modern guerrilla war, as Henry Kissinger once said, guerrillas win by not losing. It seemed that was Washington's approach when he realized that going after the main part of the British Army was a fruitless endeavor.
Yeah, he claimed to adopt what's called a Fabian strategy, going back to ancient Rome and how they fought Hannibal in the Roman Republic even. And so he was, especially after Long Island, just trying to avoid a major confrontation. But even when he said he was going to do that, he still did Brandywine, he still did Germantown, he still did Monmouth. It isn't for a couple more years after that. I think a lot of things changed during that war, and part of that was Washington's understanding of the arithmetic of that war.
Did the British lose their chance to win the Revolutionary War if it were winnable on such a large geographic area? Did they lose their chance to win when they allowed Washington to escape Long Island?
There are so many different outcomes that could have happened with this war that are not all or nothing. In terms of keeping all 13 colonies on their side, I don't even think that was probably possible at that moment. Yeah. It would have been a long, protracted struggle for forever, probably. But they would have ended Washington's war, and that would have been a big, major deal, and quite possibly could have held on to a lot of the other colonies. I think they could have held on to the South and New York City virtually till not quite the end of the war, but probably until 1780.
The riddle of General Howe, who's chasing Washington across New York and then into New Jersey, but the battles, plural, of Saratoga in 1777. Why did General Howe decide to go to Philadelphia instead of meeting up with Burgoyne, where he was supposed to go, according to Burgoyne, to try to sandwich the Continental Army and potentially cut the colonies in half? He goes to Philadelphia.
He thought that a war here would be won the way they were in Europe, by seizing the capital of the enemy. And Philadelphia was that. And he went and took it. Now, it wasn't the kind of capital they had in Europe. That's at least one reason. And Burgoyne, that's a very tangled tale of who knew what when, about whether they were going to meet up. It's not clear.
The latest evidence is that Burgoyne knew before he told his officers.
Yeah.
And still went. So who's to blame for that?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But Howe, in addition to taking the capital, he wanted to destroy Washington's army.
Right.
And he knew Washington's army would, and he was right, would be defending the capital. He just
Right.
thought they'd defend it longer.
Yeah, kind of a European approach to fighting wars, capture the opponent.
What's crazy about Howe's campaign is how long he spent on the water trying to get to Philadelphia. Probably hurt him more than anything.
Yeah, with his men and horses suffering in hot ships and dying. I mean, just
awful.
We're only touching the very tip of the iceberg for your 12-hour film, which I want everyone listening to this to watch for themselves. We're living in a very hyper-polarized time now. I've listened to some of Ken Burns' interviews that he's done for the publicity for the show. Origin stories. They can be unifying, but it's hard to find unity in something like a Revolutionary War. I don't know. What's your final thoughts on that? And the moment that we're in right now, about to celebrate America 250.
Well, Thanksgiving just happened, and we don't have that many topics that we can safely discuss
At the dinner table.
I was suggesting sports was one option, and somebody started telling me how much they love Aaron Rodgers, and I told them, okay, sports are not a comfortable subject either. So maybe we have shared history that we can use as a springboard to breaking bread. I don't know. I will say that the 8 years of the American Revolution plus the decade before, decade after, were incredibly uncertain times. And if we're living through uncertain times, which I think we are, we should recognize that in those uncertain times, there's an awful lot of possibility. We don't know what the future is going to bring, but we know that they didn't know what the future was going to bring either. And a lot of people went to work and they worked together and they created something.
Yeah, one of the most important events in human history. As Gordon Wood says in the documentary, those words in the Declaration of Independence, we don't have a country, or the country that we've come to know, without those words.
David's and my mutual friend, Dayton Duncan, who was a political operative for many years. He was press secretary for 2 Democratic candidates for president. He said he was glad there had not been a press conference after the passage of the Declaration of Independence, because the first question would have been, what do you mean by all men are created equal? And I think he said, thank God the press was not there, because we are still working on that.
Yeah, I don't feel like you have to come away with this from your film wanting unity or having to agree. Democracy is a state of perpetual argument. I think you can be both inspired by the events depicted in your documentary while also embracing the complexity. I mean, that's what makes it more interesting.
Somebody who had only watched the first episode texted me, is like, it bothers me that differences have to be settled with so much bloodshed. And I said, that's one way to look at it, but keep watching, because they get through these 8 years of work and they try to come up with a system that will allow for, obviously there's a civil war that comes 80 years later, but that can try to allow us to settle disagreements peacefully.
Sure, I prefer peace too. One of the founding ideas, though, is that people do have a right, a natural right, to throw off the yoke of an abusive government, and that often does involve violence.
It's right there in the Declaration.
Enslaved people would have agreed with that, because slavery was a system predicated on violence. And throughout the 20th century, wars of national liberation. The American Revolution, even though that term probably wasn't around then, was a war of national liberation. David, you mentioned Fabian before, where Washington was the Fabian tactics. He wasn't following Mao Zedong or Ho Chi Minh, but same concept, right? We fought a war of national liberation for our rights.
Yeah, I mean, without a nation, it's nation building at the same time. Yeah. It's a lot of things, the American Revolution. And what I think above all it is a story of people and humanity. And humanity is ugly and it is beautiful. All of that is present in that generation. And I think maybe it's helpful to recognize that's the case about people 250 years ago, to maybe just be a little bit kinder to each other. I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah, I second that. People tell you that you should study history because it repeats itself. It doesn't really repeat itself, I don't think. But it's really important for people to understand that historical figures did not know what was going to happen on Tuesday, just the way we don't know what's going to happen on Tuesday. That they are flawed, just the way we are flawed. And if you accept those things, you realize that people now can do great things. And if you think of those people as flawless, which is what I was taught in 4th grade, there's no evidence in that we can do great things. If there's any reason why I like doing history, it's that.
The Declaration of Independence was formally ratified on July 4th, 1776. Just 1,337 words that ended with the phrase, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." When Rhode Island delegate Stephen Hopkins, who had palsy, signed the document, he is said to have remarked, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not."
We thank David Schmidt and Geoffrey Ward for their work. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll return to the 20th century, Robert McNamara and Vietnam, a new book that I happen to review for Responsible Statecraft, McNamara at War. And our guest will be Frederick Logoval, Why Robert McNamara Still Matters. That is next as we report History as It Happens. Make sure to sign up for my free newsletter. Just go to Substack and search for History as It Happens.